I have no business being here fronting the Center for Textual Studies because I am not a textual scholar. I realized that many years ago when I started studying Sanskrit at Oxford, and I was in a little class with a wonderful professor who was, it has to be said, a very deep philologist, and the classes with him were all about the intricacies of the language. And these were wonderful Hindu texts, and I wanted to know what they meant, but he never told us. And it got worse one day when he took us down into the depths of the Bodleian, and there he pulled out some ancient Sanskrit manuscripts, and that's what's sort of vaguely illustrated up there. And clearly what he wanted was to try and educate the next generation of Sanskrit textual scholars. And I looked at these wonderful things and I realized I couldn't even begin to read them. So at that stage I thought, no, I'm not going to be a textual scholar. On the other hand, and this is the sort of positive point behind that story, there was something about the texts themselves which was just so beautiful. The texts were artifacts from another world, and they told me about that world, and I just found myself totally drawn into that world, though I have to say that I did prefer my texts neatly printed in a way that I could actually read them. Okay, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about something which I've been doing for years and which I still think about both in practical and theoretical terms. So I'm going to say a little bit about the practice of comparative theology, which is what I do, or what I think I try to do. And I'm always interested in both the practical side of this. How do you actually do comparative theology? How do you read texts? And at the same time, what's the theory behind this? What do we think we're doing when we're doing comparative theology? Now, comparative theology is a sort of theological hospitality in which a familiar religious text is opened up and explained by being read alongside one from another religious tradition. There's no need to go into the origins and the forms of comparative theology. Partly it comes out of the discourse of religious studies, or more exactly, what used to be called comparative religion, the juxtaposition of cross-religious themes and ideas which would throw light on their deeper inner meaning. Partly it's got its roots in the Catholic renewal of pastoral theology as a response to Vatican II's call to engage in, as Nostra Aetate puts it, conversation and collaboration. Conversation and collaboration with other religious traditions. The leading lights behind comparative theology are mainly textual scholars, with an abiding concern for theological questions, which is not to say that they're all Catholics cast in the mold of my friend Frank Clooney, who's a Jesuit Indologist from Harvard and the acknowledged godfather of comparative theology. A point constantly repeated in the literature is that one does not have to be a Christian to do comparative theology. Indeed, one of the most influential figures is John McCransky, one of the editors of Buddhist Theology. Sounds unlikely, doesn't it? A Buddhist Theology, a collection of articles that grapples with the meaning of Buddhist life and practice as it engages with the contemporary non-Buddhist world. Nor is it exactly comparative theology a school of theology. In the last couple of decades, comparative theology has attracted a great deal of theological interest and a degree of critical assessment, mainly in the USA, now also in Germany, and even here in the United Kingdom. But it makes more sense, I think, to see comparative theology as a style rather than a school, a way of thinking theologically, a way of learning from the parallels, continuities, even the touches of strangeness that emerge from a sustained engagement with the other. As such, it fits into the category of what Paul Griffiths calls religious or reverential reading. Griffiths' model is what pre-modern religious communities have always done, building commentarial traditions out of the liturgical celebration of canonical texts. Jewish Talmudic commentary, for instance, can be understood as an application of the wisdom of Torah to questions raised by life in a wider non-Jewish society. Or to take a completely different example, the vast anthologies and compendia of Mahayana Buddhism are the result of guided study and meditation that together draw out the inner meaning contained in the brief aphorisms or sutras of the Mahayana tradition. At the heart of both is a pedagogy developing the skills of a discerning reading through an activity of meditative repetition. Now, a fair number of comparative theology studies have been published, what you might call the fruits of the work of comparison. For example, a dialogue between Meister Eckhart and the Theravadin commentator Buddhaghosa, to name one of my own humble efforts. Very short, I must say. The aim, however, is not to produce weighty tomes, or even to extract nuggets of wisdom from other texts, an exercise which would risk descending into a sort of spiritual colonialism, but to learn how to read interreligiously, to encourage careful attention to what sustains a religious world and a religious community. Emmanuel Levinas, who of course made his own philosophical contribution to Talmudic commentary, speaks about a liturgy of study. Lovely phrase there, a liturgy of study, a structured probing of traditional Jewish texts born of the conviction that meaning is to be found there. For Levinas, a word is to be found within the text, which, if it is to become, he says, a word to live by, must first become a word to learn from. If the word does not become a source of continuing inspiration that gives meaning to existence, he says, it remains a museum or a cemetery. I'll return to Levinas later and probe that idea. Meanwhile, let me stay with comparative theology. As the name implies, comparative theology involves reading texts together. Such a task is not without its own difficulties. All of us know what it's like to indulge in the sort of hermeneutical pondering to which life before the text gives rise. And all of us know how seductive it can be to gut a book as quickly and efficiently as possible, even a classic religious text, in order to assimilate its meaning and catalogue it away in the recesses of our minds. None of you do that, of course, but I'm afraid I do. This is what Griffiths calls consumerist reading. The text itself is put aside once the purpose for which one picked it up has been achieved. He sets against that religious reading or reverential reading, which is an end in itself and something you go back to over and over again. Comparative theology has its own dangers. They are perhaps a little bit more subtle than just consumerism. Other texts are treated with respect and reverence. They're not plundered for their usefulness in explicating the home tradition. Nevertheless, the exercise still involves the projecting of categories which belong properly within one tradition onto another, where, strictly speaking, they have no meaning at all. At stake here, I think, is the very capacity to make connections. how to pursue the resonances and echoes that sound from another religious world in order to come up with some sort of meaningful correlation. The particular skill of the comparative theologian is to track a way across a threshold, picking up hints and taking cues from certain words and symbols and concepts in order to build up, if not continuities, then at least positive analogies. At the same time, there has to be a certain hermeneutic of suspicion which avoids premature judgments. Getting that balance right is what's so tricky. Whatever is said is prefaced with humility and to be understood as only ever partial and preliminary. Comparative theology demands virtues of patience, fortitude, as well as practical skills of discernment and attentiveness. Wilfred Cantwell Smith used to talk about bringing into being a worldwide community he wanted through the influence of persons who were neither external observers nor uncritical participants, but mediators. People capable of moving across boundaries and enacting the patterns of hospitality which make religious communities not enclosed enclaves, but welcoming schools of faith, schools of faith. Comparative theology is perhaps best understood as just such an introduction to forms of teaching and learning which are inscribed in classical texts and the commentaries they inspire. Religious or reverential reading, to come back to Griffith's distinction, is not about extracting meaning from another religious world, but more simply, and I think more profoundly, about learning how to practice generosity and openness towards it. Which takes me finally to my title, in case you were wondering, and the topic of this paper. What is a text anyway? Griffith's distinction can help us here because he raises a question about the relationship between reading and learning. We're not referring to those useful little messages that one can send on a mobile, even I do that. The word text usually means a book or a printed work of some kind. It is, however, much more, I think, than a set of marks on paper, more even than a connected set of propositions that make sense. The point I want to make is that once we shift the emphasis from whatever is committed to writing to what gives rise to a practice of focused, if not reverential reading, the word can refer to any discrete dimension of human culture that presents itself for interpretation, a record of human endeavor that can be retrieved and performed and given a public profile. The sort of reading that comparative theology encourages helps to expand the point. Most comparative theology is bound up with the close reading of canonical texts and commentaries. In principle, however, the focus of comparison can be anything that provokes those resonances of the known and the unknown, and which lead back to a thoughtful re-engagement with the home tradition. I like to think that what I do is a version of comparative theology, a constructive exercise in interreligious learning. But I'm not a textual scholar. The object of my reflection is very often a place and what goes on there. Rituals or prayer, acts of devotion, rather than texts as ordinarily conceived. That is not to ignore the importance of studying written and oral traditions as sources of ancient and life-giving wisdom. reading in reverential mode, as Griffiths understands it, is the most familiar and often most fruitful entry point into another world. What I want to do, however, is to broaden the concept of text to take in whatever it is that can be read. Whatever it is that can be read. Geography, architecture, images and artifacts of all kind, even spontaneous conversations and moments of interpersonal contact. Whatever gives a flesh and blood reality to a community of faith can be read in the sense that they lend themselves to interpretation. This is what lends itself to interpretation. Now, in order to explore this idea and the practice of reverential reading, let me give you an example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. I'm sorry now that you're not going to be able to see these pictures quite as well as I thought you would, but I can't actually take you to the place in question, which is the Buddhapadipa temple, which is a few minutes' walk away from where I live in Wimbledon. It's just off Wimbledon Common in South London, and it's built, as you can see, in traditional Thai style in the back garden of a rather large, rather plush house. Red and white exterior, crowned with those ornate finials and delicate gilded tracery. It was formally opened in 1982 by members of the British and Thai royal families, and its community of Theravadin monks welcomes devotees from all over the country, and an increasing number, I notice, of young people who come to find out what it's all about, to discover something about Buddhism, or to practice mindfulness, or to learn something about the Buddhist tradition. And what they do is they come into this place. Inside, it is covered with beautiful frescoes with hundreds, perhaps thousands of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas adorning the walls of the shrine. Most of the elaborate and painstakingly detailed decoration there is deeply traditional. Scenes from the Buddha's life, illustrations of the great truths of Buddhism, imaginative reconstructions of the myths and legends that make up Buddhist popular culture. And it's that use of the imagination which is what I'm interested in. Because if you look closely, you'll see something more. In amongst the various disciples who seem to be eavesdropping on the Buddha's teaching are some familiar faces, some likely faces. Mother Teresa is there. Nelson Mandela is there. George Bush Sr., slightly more unlikely. Colonel Gaddafi. I think he's actually been dragged down to hell at some point. That seems appropriate. Sherlock Holmes is there. One fresco in particular catches the attention. The background, which you can see more or less up here, is lovely blue color, and in the middle of it you've got all sorts of places floating in the air. The British Houses of Parliament, the Taj Mahal, the Eiffel Tower, as well as cathedrals, other places of worship. All of this, that sort of lovely, peaceful stuff at the top, is in stark contrast to what you can't really see here, which is where people are being dragged down into a really rather nasty pit and tormented by all sorts of ghoulish monsters. However, let's forget about that bit and just move to one side, and that's one of the little details. And here you've got a number of very, again, traditional figures, these lovely Bodhisattva-type angel figures. Up here, unfortunately, it's just come off here, is an angel that would look quite at home in Bruges, in some sort of Flemish fresco. You think, well, what's going on there? Then you come down here, and you find some sort of a punk rocker. And there, Charlie Chaplin. What are they doing in the middle of all of this? Move further to one side, and you get my favorite bit of the entire fresco. Over on one side, the most unlikely addition of the lot, relaxing in the garden of a very English country house with an Alsatian dog at her feet, is the unmistakable figure of Margaret Thatcher. Now, this is, so you suddenly realize there's a hell of a lot of fun going on in this temple. How do you read it? It depicts the whole world, West and East, Buddhist and non-Buddhist, the famous and the obscure, called to contemplate the first noble truth, that human existence is insubstantial and full of suffering. That, however, is not the reason why I find it so intriguing. I read it as I would read a text, because in an obvious sense, it sums up a vast amount of Buddhist literature. Together, written text, painted text, not to mention the repeated text of ritual, the acted out text of oral explanation, the sort of thing that goes on there, they all witness to the power of the religious imagination. Now, it would, of course, be easy to regard any textually based account of religion, however conceived, as a controlling force that subordinates the cognitive to the affective, dominating the inquiring and imaginative mind with the stultifying repetition of supposedly authoritative statements. That's not what's going on here. Religious traditions are more than privileged narratives, let alone systems of belief. They're also, and primarily, that little phrase I had earlier, schools of faith, places where wisdom and learning are cultivated, important existential questions are addressed, and the skills of holy living are developed and practiced. To pick up from my opening remarks about comparative theology, acts of cross-religious comparison need to reckon not just with the ideas, thought forms, and symbols that make up the content of belief, but with the prior formative process by which people learn how to participate in an ancient tradition. But, of course, more than that. A school introduces its pupils to the texts, the traditions, the history, the classic statements that give a society its particular identity. But that's only half the story, because any worthwhile school will be concerned not just with passing on an existing wisdom, but with opening up avenues into a wider world beyond its own confines. That's what's going on here. The Buddhabadipa temple, seeking to mediate Buddhist tradition in a post-Christian diaspora, introduces young and old, committed devotees and secularized seekers into a Buddhist religious world, which, in an important sense, it actually symbolizes. Everything is gathered together inside that temple. But this is a world, this temple, with porous borders, where properly Buddhist themes, supported by Buddhist artifacts, meld into another world, a less clearly defined world where people do things differently. The guides who introduce visiting school children to this extraordinary place take delight in setting them a little task. If you go there, you can do this for yourselves. Somewhere in the building, they are told, is Superman. He's well hidden, I can assure you. He's caught in the join between two walls and surrounded by a host of, exultant winged creatures who appear to be singing the Buddha's praises. Why is he there? a witty reference to the comic book culture, perhaps, which young children would know? Or maybe just a nice little conceit, including a great Western hero in the Eastern drama, but cutting him down to size. Leaning next to Margaret Thatcher's chair is a film director's clapperboard. If anybody can tell me what that's all about, I'd be extremely grateful. What is it doing there? Maybe it's a reminder that all any picture captures is a moment in time, the middle of the 1980s. Or perhaps it's just a humorous comment on the intrinsic pretension and fragility of political life. Rampant Tory MPs, watch out. Now, however we interpret the clues and the codes that haunt the interstices of any text, I always think that textual reading is really about reading between the lines, what's going on there, but leave that for the moment. A line, at any rate, in this regard, perhaps an appropriately Buddhist middle way, a line needs to be traced between the claim to know the original intention of the author and a more anarchic insistence that all acts of representation are no more than invitations to further acts of imaginative reconstruction. In a celebrated lecture on the idea of revelation, Paul Ricoeur reminds us that, he says, what is finally to be understood in a text is not the author or his presumed intention, nor is it the immanent structure or structures of the text, but rather the sort of world intended beyond the text as its reference. Even if the painters were there to provide a summary of what was in their mind some 30 years back, if you were actually able to ask them, what do you think you were doing there? That would not prevent thoughts, further ideas, further directions being generated by the viewer's response to this particular juxtaposition of forms. That may not be the particular reason why Margaret Thatcher's put there, but I can find another way of understanding it. What holds artist and observer together is their participation in a world of discourse that precedes all our efforts to dominate or impose meaning on things. The meaning inscribed in an artifact is not fixed, as if frozen in time by that original act of writing or painting, but neither is it indeterminate, dependent on purely contingent factors or the whim of the moment. The imagination works within certain constraints, but that is not to say that the task of making connections and reconciling differences is inevitably reductionist. On the contrary, it is to enter into a chaos of imagery, ancient and modern, confident that it is possible to weave further variations out of the strands that are already there. Any given artifact, whether written document or oral narrative or a decorated place like this temple, consists at one and the same time of a certain form that limits freedom and what I shall simply call a spirit or an energy that presumes to explore it. A form that limits freedom and a spirit or an energy that presumes to explore it. Now, I've suggested that a text is anything that can be read, anything that gives itself for interpretation. It's not that frescoes and statues in a place of worship are mere decoration that enhance the sense of mystery, the background that gives an affective context to the work of interpreting the textually encoded message. Rather, I'm arguing for a much tighter complementarity between text and context. We do, of course, need some element of the latter to interpret the former, but there is more to the latter, more to that context than just aesthetic background and decoration. The artist is adding something more. This is not just a slavish reproduction of the past. Comparative theology, as I've described it, is a practice of reverential or even liturgical reading, a form, it's sometimes said, of lectio divina that grows out of a holistic attention to a religious world, not the excising of some deracinated message that supposedly transcends all particularities of culture. Like so many practices of interreligious dialogue, the object of the exercise is not the result, not the resolution, it's the exercise itself, not a means to an end, but an end in itself. So in raising my question, what is a text anyway, I am, with rather obvious sleight of hand, shifting attention away from the what to the how, from content to the act of reading. What goes on in the Buddhapadipa temple are not just Dhamma talks, guided meditation sessions accompanying the personal recitations of the devotees. The frescoes provide another way of entering into that religious world articulated in the canonical and commentarial traditions, just as the paintings in Catholic churches in medieval England formed a more immediate devotional complement to the liturgy and the sermons of priests and monks. If nothing else, the painted text acts as a reminder that all cultural artifacts appeal not just to the intellect, but to the affect as well. At stake here, however, are not just the skills of reading, but what I shall call, somewhat pompously, if you'll forgive me, a textual rationality, an interaction with the text as given, which both acknowledges the limits within which any act of interpretation must take place, and allows the imagination scope to make further a more life-giving interpretation possible. Both are necessary. Even Mrs. Thatcher has her place in religious art, if only as a variation on a theme, to force us into seeing things differently. Now, in seeking to correlate these two movements, working within limits and opening up the imagination, let me go back to Levinas and the thinking behind his Talmudic readings. I do not see Levinas as some precursor of comparative theology. He isn't interested in exploring the resonances and echoes between texts. On the other hand, I do think he has something important to say about textual rationality and the skills of reading. There are, of course, two sides to Levinas. He's both philosopher and he is a sort of Talmudic sage. And he has those two different sorts of writings that he publishes. At times, it's almost as if with Levinas you have this Old Testament prophet wandering down from the mountain to wag an irritable finger at a wicked world. I have a cartoon of him somewhere, which unfortunately I've lost, otherwise you'd have it on the board here. It has Levinas cradling the tablets of the Decalogue like a latter-day Moses. But that image of the sort of brooding philosopher jealously guarding the truth is, I think, a little bit at variance with the figure who emerges from the personal reminiscences of his many students. He was, says one, always affable, hospitable, courteous, generous, kind. That's why I like to think of Levinas as a teacher presiding over a school of faith. A demanding teacher, no doubt, but one who was never happier than when passionately communicating his most deeply held beliefs. It's important to remember that Levinas came from an austere intellectualist tradition that was deeply suspicious of the pious Judaism of the Hasidim. If the latter believed in a direct, unmediated, spontaneous sense of the love of God present in all aspects of everyday experience, the former, Levinas's tradition, based its religious practice on intense and sober study of the Talmud. This was the religious world in which Levinas was brought up, a world that privileges textuality, exteriority, and objectivity over a religious consciousness dominated by emotion, inwardness, and subjective states. The relationship between Levinas's religious background and his insistent critique of Western philosophy is mercifully beyond the scope of this paper. It's also beyond me too. Anyway, sufficient to note perhaps that the term used to describe Levinas's religious background is mitnaged Judaism. The word means opponent, and perhaps gives some insight into Levinas's relationship with his philosophical others, from Descartes and Heidegger to Buber and Derrida. They're not enemies to be refuted. They're dialogue partners in which Levinas sees as the object of the exercise a crucial engagement between Hebrew, what he calls Hebrew, and Greek philosophical traditions. In many ways, what he's doing is translating from one into the other. That's what his Talmudic stuff is all about. Levinas speaks about the remote origins of his philosophical career in terms of the reading of books, particularly what he calls national literatures, in his case, the great Russian classics and the Bible, which for him were a good preparation to Plato and Kant. The dialogue that reading opens up for him is not, however, a matter of harmonizing modes of thought, as if the two traditions of thought represent complementary, determinate beliefs, Hebrew thought and Greek thinking. It is rather a matter of allowing a prior respect for books to cultivate not just intuitive attention to the moment, but also a form of critical thinking about what is somehow given in that moment. Somehow, a distinction has to be made between the outward form of the text and the inner depth of meaning to which the marks on the page bear witness. For Levinas, the Bible and other great religious and philosophical texts are more than repositories of wisdom that belong to a bygone age. They're like invitations to enter into a demanding yet ultimately life-enhancing encounter. If I'm right in my characterization of Levinas as a teacher seeking to bring traditional wisdom into some sort of correlation with contemporary reality, then it might help to invoke an example from his Talmudic commentaries. This one focuses on a constant motif in his writing: the very different journeys made by the Greek Odysseus and the Hebrew Abraham. With reference to the story of the giving of Torah in Exodus 24, Levinas talks about the temptation of Western man, as he puts it, eager to try everything, to taste everything, to travel the universe. But this universe is fatally ambiguous, a world in which good and evil live side by side, and which tempts human beings to assume some sort of mastery. We want adventure, but we also want security. We want to be like intrepid Odysseus on his great journey of discovery, but we also want to be sure of coming back to something which is familiar. The risk is that in our desire for control and security, we elide the ambiguities. we erect a totality, which is proof against all disturbance. We desire pure or complete knowledge before taking the risk of action. And this blurs the distinctions and otherness which are written deep into our experience of the world. We simply don't see that world as it really exists in all its ambivalence. Now, Abraham's journey is different, profoundly so. Levinas tells us how at Sinai the people did the law first and then subsequently came to understand. Before the teaching inscribed in the text can be known, its power to teach must first be acknowledged. This inverted order, says Levinas, is not a matter of mere chronology. It's not practice as opposed to theory, but a thoroughly paradoxical knowing by doing. Little quotation. One accepts the Torah before one knows it. This shocks logic and can pass for blind faith or the naivety of childish trust. But it is what underlies any inspired act, even artistic, for the act only brings out the form in which it only now recognizes the model, never glimpsed before. Trust underlies any inspired act, even artistic. That takes me back to the temple and the nexus between the form that limits freedom and the energy that gives rise to further imaginative exploration. The artist responsible for those paintings was engaged in a deeply traditional activity with its aesthetic conventions and almost archaic style. Yet there are little corners and rather grander sweeps where he has felt free to insinuate something new and provocative. I suspect that what motivated him was the need to communicate Buddhist truth in a contemporary mode, a bit of Buddhist enculturation, perhaps. It is, of course, arguable that all we have in these friezes is a Buddhist nod in the direction of the postmodern, a sort of eclectic homage to other cultures and styles with their own ways of representing the human desire to communicate deeply felt convictions about the meaning of human living. The concept of intertextuality is now a commonplace. Texts repeat other texts, and every textual reading has to be related to the cultural context from which both author and reader draw the codes that direct the work of interpretation. The same is true of plays and films, paintings and sculpture, and all manner of artistic creation, even of Buddhist illustration, with its impish delight in contemporary glimpses of the Four Noble Truths. Nevertheless, I still feel something more is going on, and I'm not quite sure what that more is. So let me draw to a close by first returning to my question, what is a text anyway? I've tried to complexify the notion of text and broaden it to include any artifact or cultural construct that can be read. Hence my subtitle, The Pedagogy of Reading, or the Pedagogy of Religious Reading, to use Griffith's point. Comparative theology begins not with philosophical prolegomena, but it begins in the middle of things. That's why I like it. It begins where you are, with what is given for reflection in the present moment. I have not tried to analyze the stages of that pedagogy, though I think you could, and I think perhaps I ought to. The stages, how one enters into the formative process which texts provoke, how one moves away from the familiarity they create into other worlds, how one manages to recreate a deeper sensitivity, which is true to both poles of the encounter. 3 stages, possibly others. Nor have I touched on the tricky issue of artistic inspiration, that mysterious originating spark that gives a shape or direction to a tradition of thought and continues to inspire further rereadings and recreations. I'm interested in that equally mysterious process of close reading that comparative theology, as a practice of faith, seeks to promote and continue. Maybe what a text does is give us a fixed point around which a school of faith orientates itself, whether we're thinking of terse summaries like the Four Noble Truths, or classical commentaries which give rise to further thought, or the sort of broader texts that I've been talking about as artifacts. But to say that it's fixed, a fixed point, is only to say that it's not to be explained away and substituted by something else. If there's one lesson I take from Levinas's rather austere and difficult wrestlings with Talmudic texts, it is that human beings cannot manage without the form or structure that classic texts and imaginative artifacts provide for our thinking, which is not to say that what is given in the text exhausts, still less avoids, thought. Rather, it directs and shapes critical thinking in particular ways. Let me finish with a reference to a little Levinasian aperçu, which I found in an article entitled "How is Judaism Possible?", first published in 1959. Speaking about Jewish education and the preservation of Jewish values within a secular state, Levinas notes that, quote, "A true culture cannot be summed up, for it resides in the very effort to cultivate it." A true culture cannot be summed up, for it resides in the very effort to cultivate it. Put it another way, before culture is a noun, an object, a thing, it's a verb, an action. It is what the writer or the artist, or indeed the reader, actually does. Thank you.